Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. Hey, have you ever stopped to think about what kind of person God prefers to use? Does God prefer to use highly trained and highly educated people? Or does he prefer to use those who have not been highly trained or maybe are minimally educated? Does he prefer to use young or old? Does he prefer to use men or women? Does he prefer to use rich or poor? What kind of person does God prefer to use? And the answer to that is this: he prefers to use humble people, willing people, people who show up, people who are surrendered. The Apostle Paul is our lesson for today in Acts chapter 9. The Apostle Paul was a highly educated person. He was a great man. He had a great deal of preparation and training, not for Christianity, but for the persecution of Christianity as a leader of the Jews, as a Pharisee. J. Oswald Chambers, an author, a Christian author, wrote this about Paul. I want to read just a tiny bit to you about this. It says that a present-day parallel to the Apostle Paul would be someone who could speak in Chinese in Beijing, quoting Confucius and Mencius, write cogent theology and teach it at Oxford, and defend his cause using flawless Russian before the Soviet Academy of Sciences. By whatever comparison, Paul was certainly one of the most versatile leaders the church has known, and his versatility is apparent in the ease in which he adapted to various audiences. He could address statesmen and soldiers, adults and children, kings and royal officials. He was at ease in debate with philosophers, theologians, and pagan idol worshippers. And he was a student who studied under the influential Rabbi Gamaliel. He was advancing in Judaism, by Paul's own words, advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of his own age. Now that's what Paul was all about. He was all about being educated and being prepared. But here's what's interesting about Paul. God wasn't ready to use Paul until Paul was humbled, until Paul had come to a place where he was at the end of himself and he realized that all of his training was not important. For a matter of fact, in Philippians chapter 3, I think it's verse 7 and 8, Paul says this about himself, and this is Marty's paraphrase: "Everything I had, all that made me who I am, was lost. I considered it rubbish. I considered it garbage compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ and being found in him." And it's when Paul came to that realization in his life that Jesus began to use him in amazing ways. It wasn't because Paul was smart or well-trained or highly educated, or that he was a Roman citizen, or that he was also a Jew, or that he was trained as a Pharisee. It wasn't any of those things. Yes, Paul used those, and Christ used them through Paul. But what was really amazing, what was really important, was that Paul was surrendered. He showed up, and he allowed himself to be used. In my own life, that has always been the case for me. The times that God has used me the most has not been because I've had an education or that I had training, but that I was willing. The people that my ministry perhaps has blessed the most could care less about my training, and most about the fact that I showed up, that I loved. It's all about willingly surrendering our will to his will. That's what humility is. I want you to use me, Jesus, to the best of my ability, because you are going to be living through me. You're going to be doing those things through me. And it can only be done if I'm surrendered. Galatians 2:20 says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I live in this body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." That's what we're called to do. We're called to show up. We're called to be willing. We're called to surrender, to be humble in our service. It doesn't matter how highly trained you are. It doesn't matter what your educational achievements are. Paul even said this, there's no longer male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. We could probably add to that, there's no young or old. There's no rich or poor. There's no highly educated. There's no minimally educated. What is most important is that we all belong to Christ and we're willing to sign up and be used by Him. I encourage you this week and in the days to come to be willing to surrender your will to His will so that He can use you best.